We heard Mr. Stockton say that if we'd had the risk reduction system in place before Hurricane Katrina, we would have, which cost $15 billion, we'd have saved $130 billion. There is such a thing as 20/20 hindsight, but it seems like this country has 2400 foresight. And it's a little bit of a concern. I've heard some criticisms that our country in particular, instead of devoting money to mitigation, which Mr. Wright said should be a local function, but a lot of us feel that FEMA is not putting enough money into mitigation. A lot of mitigation money comes from grants that come ultimately from the federal government. So my question is, how do we deal with that? In other words, it seems like I've heard the criticism that FEMA wants to be the white knight that comes in after a disaster happens. Mr. Stockton gave an example. There's about a 10-to-1 benefit or even higher benefit for doing mitigation. Why should we not be putting more money at the federal level into mitigation instead of disaster assistance after it occurs?
So I agree. We'll start there, and I'll go a step farther. So this year, in what the president submitted in terms of his budget, he asked for the largest allocation to pre-disaster mitigation that has ever been requested, at $200 million a year. And I would love to see that actually be the floor in terms of where we're going. I do think this question, though, about where the dollars come from is just one of these sticky public policy pieces. If you're going to do significant, particularly structural kinds of flood mitigation, the Corps of Engineers really plays the lead across the federal agencies. I don't know the current number, but there's a little backlog, I think, between your authorized and your appropriated projects. And so I do think that we need, as a country, to look at elements like infrastructure banking and other kinds of elements that share that financial risk. But ultimately, and I think when I talk about things about a unified national program and where we go, is we also need to make sure that, yes, the feds need to bring more to the table, but we also need to find ways to ensure that we more consistently have made the business case across the country so that local jurisdictions, regional jurisdictions, are making these investments. What's your current number of backlog?
Yeah, we have about $60 billion of authorized projects, and we get about $1 billion a year to chip away at that backlog. So assuming no new projects were authorized, that would be what, 2075. And I will no longer be in this job then. I think some international examples are good, because on the International Strategy for Disaster Reduction, about 95% of their funding all goes for response and about 5% for mitigation. I think the Dutch have a good program in place. Their Delta program, they put about €1.5 billion euros a year into sustaining their system. I mean, it's a lot more important to them. It's a small country, but about the size of Maine, but 2/3 of the country is below sea level, so it means a lot more to them. They don't have any room to retreat, really. So their biggest problem is to continue to remind people that what happened in 1953, so what they say is they like to see small disasters in other countries so they can continually remind their leadership to continue to invest in mitigation to become more resilient. I mean, the parallel I draw is it's kind of like a fire department. The fire inspector that installs smoke alarms probably saves a lot more lives than the firemen, but the firemen get all the good press because they're there, they rush in, and they pull people out of the fire. So it's like, how do you create that awareness and have a long-term program to become more resilient, more sustainable? Part of this is the way the federal government budgets, and this isn't just a federal problem, it's really a shared responsibility, all levels of government and the private sector. But everything competes in a one-year budget cycle, And there's no differentiation between kind of capital investments that will provide long-term mitigation and operations expense. And so the urgent always pushes away the important out of the setting budgetary priorities process, and I think that same dynamic is in effect at the state and local level as well. Is the urgent will always push out the important long-term investment strategies because those capital investments are competing for the same dollars.
If I could add one thing, how many people in the room have read the National Preparedness Report that came out last Thursday? Show of hands. How many people have read the National Mitigation Framework? Show of hands. So if you look at the core capabilities under mitigation, the National Preparedness Report reported, the President talked about it at the National Hurricane Center last week, long-term vulnerability reduction is one of the mitigation core capabilities that needs improvement. All of the federal grant dollars that come through the National Security Council and OMB, those 5 core capabilities that showed need improvement, we align all of the grant dollars to address those core capabilities that need improvement. So when grant dollars come through our office and we look at it and say, look, are you funding something that is helping us improve that core capability of long-term vulnerability reduction? So not just pre-disaster mitigation, we look at all the grant dollars that come in, and I'm going to be looking at that long-term vulnerability core capability and making sure that those federal dollars are aligned to helping us address that gap. But I would encourage you to read the National Preparedness Report and look and see what it says about long-term vulnerability reduction. And that data comes from you. It comes from the states and local governments. You're telling us where you need help.
Great thought, Eric. Jason?
Kathy Macias, Douglasville, Douglas County Water and Sewer Authority. And I was wondering under the executive order if there's a project being built in our community with federal dollars and the community has more stringent floodplain regulations. Can the more stringent local regulations be applied, or do we just have to stick with the federal regulations?
So what the executive order directs us to do explicitly is that agencies have to consider those local regulations or standards if they are higher. I think agencies, as they go through each one of their implementing protocols, will work on those details in terms of how it applies. I will tell you, in FEMA's instance, we give deference to the local standard if it is higher. And we will continue to do that. To the degree that I'm giving technical assistance to other agencies, I will also be doing that. But that's something that each agency is going to have to look at their own programs and, frankly, look at their authorities about how those pieces hang together.
And just to add to that, though, the way we formulate projects and make investment recommendations to the administration and Congress, we will look at what where you maximize net benefits for a national economic development plan. If the local requirements are higher than that, there's a delta that locally preferred plan. So if the requirements are greater than what we can justify based upon the NED benefits, then that would be a non-federal responsibility to achieve those higher standards.
George?
I'm just wondering if you have,
A little closer, just hold it a little closer.
I'm just wondering if you have advice on how to talk to elected officials who think resiliency is dredging and running log jams.
I can't hear.
Can you repeat that? We couldn't quite hear it up here.
I'm just wondering if you have any advice on how to talk to local officials to get them more along those lines of resiliency thinking. We actually have local funds, but they are very strictly monitored for just risk reduction, and there's not sort of the forethought of natural process or green infrastructure.
So I talked with a mayor a couple of years ago who had listened to me kind of lay out this case for risk reduction in the nation and in communities. And he said, well, this is all very compelling, but you realize that you're one of 50 lines of business that I'm responsible for managing. And I was trying to be empathetic. And he said, so here's what I need from you. I need you to walk in not by telling me what my problems are. In this case, he was pushing me about flood insurance rate maps that says your risk is expanding. He says, because if you do that, you make me look like a fool in front of my constituents. What I need you to do is bring that information and show me what I can do about it, because the people who elected me want me to actually bring solutions. And he said, so better yet, show me the risk. Show me what my mitigation or risk reduction opportunities are. And if you can go one step further to show me some examples where other communities have got there so that I can imagine what this is. And so I think that as we work with community leaders, we've got to find ways to help open that aperture in terms of what's possible and do that in a way that they can actually see and touch it. I've spent more time over the last year with places like the National League of Cities, National Conference of Mayors, and National Association of Counties, because when they talk to each other, one elected to the next, and they give the examples of what they've done, it gets much farther down the road than a person from the Federal Emergency Management Agency walking in and saying, you should be concerned. And so I do think that we have to help them imagine what's possible, and even help them begin to figure out how they pay for it, because fundamentally, I think that's the biggest obstacle. And I do think, sorry, you also mentioned the nature-based kinds of side of it. I think in many respects, that broader sense of resilience related not to those nature-based approaches are things that they just haven't imagined. They're not opposed to them, but they're looking in the context of their riverine community or their inland community particularly and go, what am I supposed to do? They just haven't seen and touched it. I think we got to find ways to help them better imagine it.
Yeah, and as a local, I think public safety is huge with this. I mean, struggling with this issue at a local level and trying to gauge interest, frame it in the sense of public safety. I mean, people in our community will die if we don't do this. We buy fire trucks, we have police response, why aren't we doing floodplain management? Jason.
Yeah, Roy, in your comments, you mentioned an update to the Unified National Program, or UMP. And for someone who's been stumping for that since pre-Katrina, I applaud that statement. I think it's a bold statement. I think it's the right statement. The question I've got is Roy, could you briefly explain to the audience the significance of the UMP? Because I think many people don't know what that is. But then for the broader federal partnership, do we believe this is something we could get done within the time we have within this administration?
So I'll start at the end. I can't get it done during this administration. So it's not possible. It is something that when my next political leader arrives in 2017 that I'm going to be advocating for. So some of you know the Unified National Program. There's actually some people here, General Galloway and others, who were involved in writing the last version of it. Here's where it came from. The Flood Insurance Act of 1968, in its opening page, before you ever get to the details of what insurance is, says that there's this need to understand flood risk management in the nation. And we need a strategy that looks across that in a unified way. That it is about programs at the federal level across multiple agencies. It is about what happens in local communities, and we need to have clear strategies that advance that. The Government Accountability Office has been in to see me. They're working on a report right now. I think the Mitigation Framework Leadership Group gives us the kind of forum to begin to bring those pieces together. But I think that the National Mitigation Framework gives us, a structure to advance that. But it's, for me, the kind of things that if we're using the new executive order on the flood risk management standard for 13690, we're looking at various kinds of reforms that we can do inside FEMA related to the National Flood Insurance Program. I think we've got to prime these things so that as we get to 2017, it is something that we can demonstrate that we need. Because ultimately, probably speaking farther out of school than I should, given the fact that there are people from the little white buildings here, the ultimate answer, in my mind, needs to be at least a lens or crosscut in the president's budget that looks across all agencies and looks at this issue of mitigation and particularly, so let's start with flood, I'm concerned about other natural hazards, but with 85% of the damages coming from flood, what are we investing in this across the country? And what is that next piece? Because we make the business case for investment agency by agency by agency as opposed to collectively. And if we're trying to actually get that board of directors of 535 people to support this, we've got to find something that's far more coherent than what we're pushing forward today.
Yeah, chime in really quickly, Bill, and then we have time for one more quick question.
Okay, let me chime in real quickly that from the state and local level, I think it's really important as we approach a change of administrations that we continue advocating for the kinds of federal support that help us achieve what we need on the local level.
Agree.
Mr. Bob
My name's
Freitag,
Bob.
you have the final question. Make it simple.
Climate change is much more than just sea level rise. In the Northwest, we have a real issue with extreme flows happening in the winter. We're losing our flows in the summer period. In the next 20 years, some of our rivers will have their 100-year floods every 50 years. They're 25 every 5 and 10. But there's another side to flooding, and that's the ecosystem services provided by our floodplains and storage water and drought. And so many times in this group, we tend to think of flooding as the enemy. In Texas, in many of the rural areas, now they're thinking flooding is the friend that brought the water. And so my question, and I know the answer should be yes, I'm going to do this, Roy, so I look at you, is that in terms of the grants and HMGP and that program, there has to be looking at co-benefits and the positive effects of water, both within the assessment and within our planning. And so my question to you is, how are we doing that? And yes, we're going to do it in a greater detail. So drought is a big issue in Washington State at the moment.
So I could not agree more. I'll tell you, mitigating drought is one of the most complex issues that I get pulled into right now. There's a lot of conversation going on at the most senior levels of the administration.
Absolutely.
The president has taken a particular interest in this, which gets a lot of us continuing to talk about it. But without speaking specifically to drought, let me talk about ecosystem services. So in the Hazard Mitigation Assistance Grants programs, we made a change in how we deal with benefit costs 18 months ago. We do have ecosystem services factored into our benefit cost tool today. It is particularly in the places by which we're able to return things to green space and those natural functions that are able to be done there. It was an initial step. And we continue to collaborate with the academic community as well as other agencies to look at additional ways by which we can give greater credit for those benefits. Director Sean Donovan at OMB has made it a priority that says this needs to be done in a way. So for those who understand the Inside the Beltway, OIRA, the Office of Information Regulatory Affairs, has kind of oversees how agencies deal with these cost-benefit elements. They've been directed to find ways to broaden how we deal with these elements. And so we will continue to take those steps. They don't require legal changes. They require us to be able to pull the right kind of science in a repeatable way so that it can be done. Frankly, it's easy in the coastline area. By the time you get to the riverine area, it's a harder lift, but I'm optimistic that more and more of those information and data will become available.